Mr. Harris here, and welcome to a new video of chapter 4.2. In this video, we're going to discuss about the birth process, some signs of pregnancy, and finally, we'll talk about parenting. So before we begin, let us recall and recap what we have talked about in the previous video. So in the previous video, I mentioned how the embryo would eventually grow into a fetus, and this process takes roughly around 8 weeks when the major organs start to be formed, and that is when we'll be calling the embryo a fetus. And right after roughly 30 weeks, or I should say 38 weeks in total, that is when the fetus will be born. That is when the mother will give birth, or roughly around 9 months. So pregnancy will last roughly from 38 weeks to 9 months. However, a better word to use is when the mother goes into labor. So, what exactly is labor? Labor is when the muscles of the uterus and the abdominal wall they contract strongly and regularly. So, let's look at some details into the birth process. So, first off, as I've mentioned, this process is called labor, which is when the muscles of the uterus and abdominal wall they contract strongly and repeatedly. Now, because of this muscle contraction, the amnion it breaks. And if you guys recall, the amnion, I use an analogy of a bubble. It's like the outer layer that supports the baby, protects it from absorbing shock, or acts like a cushion. So inside the amnion, you have the amniotic fluid, which is flowing out over here. So let's see over here. The amniotic fluid, it's flowing out, and this causes the vagina to be lubricated. So it lubricates the vagina. So this actually helps and assists in the birth process. The next step is when the neck of the uterus will eventually become wider, and you'll also notice one thing, which is that the head of the baby is starting to pop out. Eventually, through the repeated contractions of the muscles, the fetus is pushed out through the vagina, and as I mentioned, the head of the baby will come out first. Finally, the placenta over here is also pushed out. Now that the baby is born, everyone's super excited, happy. It's an amazing feeling. However, one thing we need to pay attention is that the umbilical cord it needs to be clipped and cut off. Now the reason behind is in a couple of days the remains of the umbilical cord will dry up and fall off, and all of us will have something in common, which is this: a scar is left behind on the abdomen, which is called the navel, or how maybe some of you will know it as the belly button. So basically, the belly button is a scar left off when we have cut off the umbilical cord. Interesting, eh? So now that we know what's the birth process, let's recap and conclude. During labor, the muscles of the uterus and abdominal wall they contract strongly and repeatedly. Now this causes the fetus to push out through the vagina. Okay? So now that we're familiar with the birth process, what are some signs of pregnancy then? How do parents know, or how does the mother know she is pregnant? So one of the most reliable signs is that there is no menstruation occurring. So before I go further, let us recall what is the definition of menstruation. This is the breaking down of the uterine lining. Okay? So as we recall, earlier I've mentioned that the menstrual cycle, each cycle lasts for around 28 days. And if a mother does not have menstruation in these 28 days or even further, a longer period of time, then that could be a major hint or a major sign that she is pregnant. There are some other signs of pregnancy. So, first off, if the mother's having nausea or feeling nausea, going to the washroom often, so frequent urination. This is constipation, so not being able to do number two, feeling tired very easily. And the do's of pregnancy is that first off, you must have a balanced diet. You should do gentle exercises to ease any discomforts. And I think this also applies to our current situation right now. We should all have a balanced diet. We should do regular exercise at home daily because we're not going out as often. So please make sure you're doing some exercise. Visit the doctor regularly, and this is just to do some checkups for both the mother and the baby. So this is not only for one particular person, it's for both the mother and the baby. The don'ts of pregnancy: you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't drink alcohol, you shouldn't take any medicines without asking the doctor's advice. And now that the baby is born, of course, we know that the babies are super small, they cannot take care of themselves, and this is why parenting is necessary. So, what exactly is parenting? So, parenting involves anything that the parents can provide their love and care with. This is to ensure that the children they can grow up to survive, they can grow and develop properly. So, what exactly is parenting? You may not know yet, but just some examples. Parenting involves providing food, providing clothing, providing shelter, a home to live, for example, providing an education, just like how you guys are doing right now. And parenting may actually begin with breastfeeding in certain households. So, breastfeeding is very easy. It is when the baby is being fed by the mother. Breast milk contains all the necessary nutrients for growth, and also breastfeeding gives babies a sense of safety because the distance between the mother and the baby is very small. The mother and the baby will have a very good bond. However, some mothers they would prefer you giving their babies the baby milk formula or baby formula or however you want to name it. However, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, some parents or some mothers they would prefer giving breast milk because it already contains all the nutrients. But for baby milk formula, it may not contain all the nutrients. So it really depends on mothers to mothers. So let's wrap up this video. The most reliable sign of pregnancy is the absence of, yes, the absence of menstruation. Newborn babies, they cannot take care of themselves, so parenting is very essential for their survival, growth, and development. All right, so in this video, we talked about the birth process, the birth process, and then we mentioned about some signs of pregnancy, and the most reliable being the absence of menstruation. And finally, we discussed about what parenting is all about. And of course, I also introduced about breastfeeding and how breast milk contains all the necessary nutrients for growth of the baby. All right, so that's the end of this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.